Good evening. I'd like to call this June 5th, 2019 meeting of the James City Planning Commission to order. Mr. Holt, please call the roll.
Ms. Dowdy. Here. Ms. Dowdy represents the Stonehouse District. Ms. Leverins, who's an at-large member, could not be with us this evening. Mr. Polster. Here. Mr. Polster represents the Jamestown District. Mr. Schmidt. Here. Mr. Schmidt represents the Roberts District. Mr. O'Connor. Here. Mr. O'Connor is an at-large member. Mr. Kropp. Here. Mr. Kropp represents the Powhatan District and is this year's Vice Chair. Mr. Haldeman. Here. Mr. Haldeman represents the Berkeley District and is this year's Chair. I'm Paul Holt, Director of Community Development and Planning for the county, and sitting to my left is Mr. Max Salavin, our Deputy County Attorney. Mr. Chairman, we have a quorum.
Thank you. We now have time for public comment. This is for topics not subject to a public hearing. Speakers are limited to 3 minutes. Do we have any speaker cards? No speaker cards. Would anybody like to speak to the commission? Seeing none, thank you very much. Reports of the commission. DRC report, Mr. Polster.
Yeah, the DRC met on the 22nd of May. Unfortunately, we did not have a quorum, but we did convene a meeting today, this afternoon at 5 o'clock to hear both cases. And they'll appear on your consent calendar. And the results of that were with the Croker Road, there was a 4-0 for approval. And for the Menzel Road Division, for Lot 1, there was a 4-0 vote for. And for the Lot 2, a 3-1 vote for.
Thank you very much. Any questions of Mr. Polster? Policy Committee report, Mr. Kropp.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This report was written by Ms. Leverins, but because she's absent this evening, I'll read it on her behalf. The Policy Committee met at 4 p.m. on May 9th, 2019. Committee members present were Rich Kropp, Julia Leverins, and Tim O'Connor. Staff members present were Ellen Cook, Max Halavin, Paul Holt, Tom Leininger, John Reisinger, and Tammy Rosario. Mr. Leininger presented for Stage 1 committee review issues and options for amending the county's ordinance for wireless communication facilities. The General Assembly has passed legislation that affects deployment of small cell facilities and specifies which type of projects may be processed administratively. Committee discussion focused on how best to incorporate the required changes in the existing ordinance. Given the rapid changes in technology and the likelihood that wireless communications will be a subject of upcoming comprehensive plan review, the committee agreed with staff to make limited changes now sufficient to meet the state's requirement. Staff will propose draft amendments to the ordinance for Stage 2 review at a future date. Mr. Holt presented recent changes to the Code of Virginia, which appeared to address the concerns that in 2016 caused the county to decide to not to accept further residential proffers. In response to an initiating resolution by the Board of Supervisors, staff studied the code changes and are evaluating the effects on the county. In anticipation of being able to use proffers as a tool again, staff proposed reversing the 2016 change to Section 24-16 of the zoning ordinance. Committee members discussed questions and concerns, and it's been forwarded to the Planning Commission this evening for further discussion. In response to a request by the Development Review Committee, after an applicant requested a waiver of the county's ordinance requiring underground utilities to a temporary construction office, staff proposed language that would allow the Director of Planning to waive the requirement if appropriate. Future requests could be administrative at the discretion of the planning director if the amendment passes. The proposed amendment inserts the following in Section 24-111, temporary offices, and I quote, "If the Director of Planning finds that it is not practicable for the application to meet the requirements of Section 24-200, then such requirements shall not apply to the temporary office, provided that all other provisions of this section are met," end quote. The committee voted to recommend approval of this amendment to the Planning Commission, and this also is on this evening's agenda. And that concludes my report, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Any questions of Mr. Kropp? Seeing none, thank you. Move on to the consent agenda. Consent agenda items are determined to be non-controversial and will be voted as a group. However, a planning commissioner may pull any item for discussion. There are 4 items for consideration. Would anybody like to pull any item?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not going to pull an item, but just an administrative note. I won't be voting on the May 1st meeting minutes because I was not present for that.
Now that you mention it, neither was I, so. May I have a motion, please, to approve the consent agenda?
I'll make a motion that we approve the consent items.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you.
And we'll show that, Mr. Chairman, as 2 abstentions for the minutes.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
Public hearings. There are 4 on the agenda tonight. Number 1 is SUP-19-0010, 4897 Norge Dental Center expansion. Mr. Leininger, good evening.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the Commission. Mr. Adam Pratt of Coppin and Knowles has applied for a special use permit to allow for a expansion of 3,000 square feet to the existing Norge Dental Center site located at 7450 Richmond Road. The property is zoned A1 General Agriculture, designated low-density residential in the comprehensive plan land use map, and is located inside the primary service area. The new expansion will add 68 treatment rooms to the existing facility, addition of 25 parking spaces, and a storage building. The application proposes a boundary line adjustment between them and then the property behind them at 127 Peach Street. A medical clinic is a specially permitted use in the A1 zoning district. Some of the SUP conditions include keeping consistent with the previous SUP design requirements and increased landscaping and a bike lane along the front of the property. Currently, the Norge Dental Center has 16 treatment rooms for 5 dentists. The site has 44 off-street parking spaces. Previously, this property received an SUP by the Board of Supervisors on December 11, 2001 for the ability for 10,500 square foot dental clinic. Staff finds this proposal to be compatible with the surrounding development and consistent with the 2035 comprehensive plan and zoning ordinance. Staff recommends that the Planning Commission recommend approval of this application to the Board of Supervisors subject to the proposed conditions. I'll be happy to answer any questions you have at this time, and the applicant is here as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions for Mr. Leininger? Mr. Croft?
Good evening, Mr. Leininger. Just for clarification, at the time of the staff report, there was a comment that the applicant did not agree with condition 6 regarding the bike lane. Has that since been resolved, or is that still an open disagreement?
It's still an open.
Is there any part of the bike lane between Croker Road and this applicant's property on the west side of Richmond Road? Has any of it,
On the westbound side.
on the westbound sector, has any been built yet, or is,
At the moment.
but it's planned?
Is on the regional, adopted regional bikeways map to include a bike lane all the way down.
Thank you.
And that will be part of the VDOT project that'll get underway here in the next couple of years, all the way from the intersection all the way back to at least the entrance to the shopping center. Bike lane component.
Thank you. Any other questions of Mr. Leininger? Thank you. Any disclosures by any commissioners? None. Thank you. I'd like to open the public hearing. Okay. Our way.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good evening, members of the commission. I'm Greg Davis from the Kaufman Knowles Law Firm here in 4801 Courthouse Street in James City County. With me tonight is Adam Pratt, my colleague, who has done the bulk of the work on the application. Also with me tonight is Dr. Timothy K. Johnston, who's the founder of the Norge Dental Clinic, and Chase Grogg from Land Tech Resources, which is the project engineering firm. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. Dr. Johnston started his dental practice in Norge, one dentist and one staff member in 1989. The practice has grown, and in 2001, I appeared before this commission seeking a special use permit, which was granted to establish the Norge Dental Center building, with which I expect most of you are familiar in Norge. At that time, in 2002, the practice had grown to 3 dentists and 12 staff members. but the practice has continued to grow and now employs 5 dentists and 30 staff members, operates a dental assistant training program out of the building, and is poised for growth. As growth has taken place at Norge Dental Center, the 44 current parking spaces at the office have proven inadequate. Patients are sometimes late for appointments because they have to wait for a parking space to open in order to park and come into the building. The treatment rooms stay busy. We have some concerns that patients may queue up out of the parking lot for the dental center actually onto Richmond Road, an issue we discussed with the staff. It's a great story of a hard-working business person and professional in our community who establishes in Norge a great community, builds an attractive facility, and finds success. The application presents few planning challenges: traffic analysis, public facilities analysis, stormwater resource protection, and cultural historic resources work all show negligible impacts. Dr. Johnston has been to visit his neighbors. Richard Bradshaw owns the property to the rear. You might call that north or northeast of his property. Mr. Bradshaw had no objections. He visited with Father Tom Mattingly at St. Olaf's, who again expressed no objections to the expansion. Ms. Bagwell, who lives next door, also consented, saying that as long as it wasn't a cell tower or apartments, she was in favor. Just to orient you a bit as to the plans for the site, this is the proposed master plan. You have this in your package, I believe. This one's a little hard to read, but I think you can follow. The existing building is circled in yellow. It's not circular in shape, of course, and the existing parking is highlighted here to the right and to the rear as you stand on Richmond Road and look toward the facility. The expansion is planned to the rear. So you see the building expansion will be in addition to the present building. Then there's a storage shed to the rear and additional parking, which would likely be built as a first phase of the project, followed by the shed and then the building expansion. Mr. Haldeman, you pointed out the applicant's concern over special use permit condition number 6, which would require construction of a bike lane consistent with section 24-32 of the county code. And that is a topic I'd like to address with the commission. My request tonight would be that the commission recommend approval of this application, but that it recommend to the Board of Supervisors that the bike lane not be required. The objection is not one that Dr. Johnson has based on loss of land. There is land on the VDOT right-of-way, and he may even have room on his site to expand the bike lane. That's not the issue. But this schematic, I think, will demonstrate the issue. So to orient you, you see Richmond Road at the bottom of this screen, and then the existing building schematically represented there at the top. Currently, there is a ditch, a drainage ditch, just adjacent to Richmond Road. Exactly in the location where a bike lane would have to be located. In addition, part of that ditch is a concrete swale, which extends down eastward toward Ms. Bagwell's property. Further, there are 2 utility pedestals located right on the edge of this ditch, and likewise, there are underground cables here shown by the wavy red line, which are serviced, of course, by those pedestals. Further, here's the sidewalk that Dr. Johnson constructed pursuant to the SUP granted in 2001. That was a special use permit condition at that time. And even though that sidewalk does not connect as you move east, Dr. Johnson built that, and it's in place today. But next to that sidewalk are 3 what I call telephone poles. I think the proper term is utility poles, and they have Dominion Resources wires on those. We think that the utilities underground are cable and phone, according to Land Tech. So to create the bike lane, the first thing that has to happen is you have to move the ditch. Move the ditch from next to Richmond Road uphill. Now remember, the topography here is this is up a slope toward the Norge Dental Center building. Then we have to move the pedestals for the underground utilities, and we have to move the utilities themselves. So the point of this is that this involves the permission of these utility providers. They have easements there. We can't simply dig up their lines, and move them without those permissions, and there's no guarantee, of course, that those would be granted. Further, much of this work takes place in the VDOT right-of-way. Then, even if one assumes that the permissions didn't block the project or delay it tremendously, there's the cost of relocating these utilities both above ground and below ground, which again could be prohibitive to an expansion like this to a small business operation. The special use permit condition that is before you tonight would require that this bike lane be constructed before a certificate of occupancy could be issued to Dr. Johnston's expansion. And yet, my advice to Dr. Johnston would be, unless you have clear permission and have a handle on the cost of moving these utilities, you shouldn't even start the project, because you could invest in the expansion and then not be issued a CO because of the failure of your ability to build a bike lane. This is a view of Richmond Road looking eastward toward Lightfoot. Dr. Johnston's practice would be on the left-hand side as we look at this picture. And this is Ms. Bagwell's house, the brick house here. You can see the end of the drainage ditch right adjacent to Richmond Road. This is the concrete swale portion I mentioned. This picture may not be as bright as it could be, but this is an uphill slope, and this is the sidewalk that Dr. Johnston had previously constructed under the special use permit conditions imposed in '01, and as you can see, it's stubbed. It does not connect. Antec points out that in this area, even if a bike path could be constructed, the telephone poles that line Richmond Road into the distance are just a foot or two from the edge of Richmond Road. I'm assuming that occurred due to expansion of Richmond Road over the years. And so a bike path, a bike lane immediately adjacent to Richmond Road would require removal of those, which would be a huge expense and burden. So in summary, members of the Commission, this is a good story about a growing dental practice that serves a great number of our county fellow residents. It's consistent with the comprehensive plan and current zoning. The architecture will be consistent with the attractive architecture that Dr. Johnston has employed in the existing building. But the bike lane condition is problematic for the project, and thus we respectfully request that you follow the staff's recommendation and vote approval of the or recommend approval of the application, but recommend to the Board of Supervisors that the bike lane requirement be omitted. I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Any questions of Mr. Davis? I have two, if I may. Number one, the expansion in the back, as you step off, if you will, from the existing parking lot, it goes downhill. It goes into a swale.
Yes, sir.
Would you build that up to put the new parking lot in the storage shed, or would you build it at a lower level, or what's the plan for that?
I'll ask Mr. Grogg to address that. He's the engineer on the project.
Chase Grogg with Land Tech Resources, 3925 Midlands Road, Williamsburg, Virginia. It's going to get its own stormwater, so the stormwater for the site is all treated with an infiltration pond up front. So it would be graded with the grade that's there with a new BMP. The master plan, if you go back to it, shows a proposed BMP in the back.
Further back, I saw that. But I was just curious, so the new parking lot will be on the same grade level as the existing parking lot?
No, it's going to go down. They're not going to bring it a bunch of
That's
fill.
what I was questioning.
Yeah, lower.
The other question, and probably for you, Mr. Grogg, is it possible to put the bike lane inside the drainage ditch, between the drainage ditch and the sidewalk? Is it?
So I believe the requirement is that it's actually attached to the edge of pavement and that it's 5 feet wide. So the intent there is for the bike lane to go right down the edge of pavement, and that's why we've pointed out going down Norge, you have a bunch of telephone, to continue this, it's great. It's just like the sidewalks, just like the one he already did, that theoretically in time they would all be connected. But to extend a bike lane and have the connectivity through all of Norge would require a lot of utility movement and a great cost. But so the intent is so that it's actually attached to the edge of pavement, and is why we pointed out the telephone poles. It's not like the multi-use paths that can kind of, go finagle wherever they go. You're welcome.
Any other questions? We have time for public speakers. I have one speaker card from Mr. Gregory Davis. I just looked at it. Sorry about that. Does anybody else want to speak to this subject? Seeing none. We'll close the public hearing. Discussion by commissioners.
I'd like to revisit this bike lane issue just a bit further. And I understand the regional bikeways plan, that we have all this connectivity, but how do you deal with the situation? Like right now on the on the westbound part of Richmond Road, on the side where the dental office is, there's, from my recollection, very little, if any, existing bike lanes. Is that right? And then, so if the plan is to have a series of bike lanes all interconnected, but they all have the same utility issues and drainage issues, how does staff approach an issue like this? What I'm getting at is, were there some fruitful discussions between the applicant and the staff on this condition number 6? And since this is just the tip of the iceberg for that whole section of Richmond Road, how do future property owners deal with this sort of a situation?
I mean, it would really be the same as it would for any development along any road in the county. As that development comes online, they would have to work through those utility issues and those proximity issues when they get down to that level of design. But for those few and far between roadway public improvement projects, that's how these sidewalks and mixed-use paths and bike lanes are being implemented to plan. So every site's different, but the premise would be the same. That would be a cost of the development. The ordinance does not have provisions to take into account cost as a so.
Thank you.
Any other comments?
Just for consistency on the bike lane piece, if I recall correctly with the Oakland Point, the bike lane is on the east side. And so why, if we have one on the east on 60, we're insisting that this bike lane be on the west? So where's the continuity of the whole idea?
The bicyclist heading west, you want to be able to ride with the flow of traffic.
I think that's maybe even
Especially when it's on the road. Mixed-use trails
I
might be a
got
little
you.
bit different, but when it's
All
on the
right,
road.
I got you.
Yeah.
I know with sidewalks, we have cash in lieu of. Is that an option with the bike?
There are those provisions in the code for modifications and exceptions at the site plan stage, based on engineering criteria and those.
Yeah, just
That would require leaving the condition in place.
Correct.
no idea what the figure would be, but I mean, I was sitting there doing Google Street View the whole time during the presentation, and it's got to be a massive cost. And I mean, this is a business that provides a really important service to the community, and I mean, I would venture to guess that it might even be cost prohibitive to make that and do all the other changes they want to make. But I'm a big proponent of the bike plan. I mean, one bottle of water gets you like 2 miles or 5 miles. So, I'd like to see us move that way. But I don't know, it's tricky. There's just all those utilities down the way. How we can make this work.
But along the same way, aren't we going to ask the VDOT guys for when they do the bikeway and widening of the road from the Croker back to the shopping center to do the same thing?
Yep. I mean,
A lot of utility relocation for that component.
And so the dental clinic property is within the path of the VDOT project.
It's adjacent. I mean, it's on the other side of the church.
VDOT goes from Croker intersection to Norge Lane, so it'll be from the bank.
The sidewalk
up to
component, the bike lane component of it isn't going east of the shopping center entrance.
Mr. O'Connor brought up an interesting fact. Does the applicant have the option to respond to the condition by putting funds against the regional bikeway plan, similar to what we've done, with affordable housing issues and so on and so forth. Is there a third option between you must do a bike path, I won't do a bike path, and can we make a contribution to the county's regional bikeways plan?
It's in there, but it's not an equal third option. You can't just sort of voluntarily pick that. If you get to a point where, for engineering or other site constraint reasons, you can't put one in, that's the result of some fairly stringent criteria that are in the ordinance.
And I guess my question, what I'm sort of probing for, and I don't know how to articulate this really well, but is there a way for us to approve the SUP with a caveat that there has to be some continued work on Condition 6 or to address the intent of Condition 6 about the bike lane? Is there, are there some opportunities for the applicant to work with the county to come up with an alternative?
I mean, we're happy to sit down with the applicant. I'm not sure, I know it might be difficult to prescribe a very loose SUP condition. It might make the applicant unclear as to what it is they really need to do as well, but I'll defer to Mr. Davis on perspective.
Chairman, if I may, if I remember the ordinance correctly, and Mr. Lavin's here to watch over my shoulder, the ordinance does not require the SUP condition. The ordinance requires the bike lane as a part of site plan approval. The planning director is empowered to waive the bike lane if the Board of Supervisors approves the master plan and the SUP without the condition. So even if the Planning Commission recommended and the board agreed, there would still be an ordinance requiring the bike lane, and Mr. Holt would still have the power to waive or not the bike lane.
No, at that point, if the board adopts that master plan, there's a criteria in there that says, or is otherwise shown on a binding master plan adopted by the board. So I wouldn't get a second bite at the apple, if you will, to use some frequent language. So, I mean, if the board adopts that and takes that off of there, then that would not be a requirement at that point.
Even at the site plan stage?
At the site plan stage, yes. Saw that a little bit with a different variation with the Wawa a couple of months ago. The same regional bikeways plan called for the same. They had proposed an alternative, and that's what ended up being approved by the board on the master plan. So when that comes in as a site plan, that will have to be consistent with the board's approval. But we wouldn't, as part of staff and staff review, we wouldn't start back at square one.
So is there an alternative that would be acceptable both the applicant and staff possibly, that widening the existing sidewalk to accommodate the same as a pathway?
Yeah, multi-use trail kind of thing. I was thinking.
Yes, you may. Your applicant.
Photos don't do, I'm sorry, Timothy Johnston, 610 Colony Trail. My office is 7450 Richmond Road. Does that satisfy everybody? The pictures didn't do it justice, but if you start taking the landscape topography from Richmond Road, it goes Richmond Road, the ditch, part of which is concrete as it approaches Mrs. Bagwell. Then it goes up to the sidewalk, which was built according to the governance at the time, so it's just wide enough for a sidewalk.
It goes back down.
And then it goes back down to create my BMP. And then it goes across for the BMP and then back up to the sidewalk that goes to my building. Look at it from Google Earth, Street View, whatever. When we built Norge Dental Center originally, we met all the requirements at the time. Now you're changing the requirements, but there was no space allowed for changing requirements. And the only way to do it is to really, there's no way to do it. Other than going out into the middle of Richmond Road and extending that, or digging up everything underground and everything overhead, and then I mean, you can't do that because what are we going to do when we get to the part that's not my property? When we get to Mrs. Bagwell and you're going to take a line of utilities from up here and suddenly it's, mine is over here now. What's the connection look like there? She's not going to pay to have it connected through her yard. The church is not going to pay to have it connected through their yard. You're talking about moving utilities, taking a section like a railroad track and moving it over 5 feet and expecting the train to run.
But I think the question is, with regard to Mr. O'Connor's question, is you got a sidewalk that's built on sort of the crest of a dune there.
Correct. And it's,
No
the answer to
ability
your
to
question,
widen
you
that.
cannot widen that enough. We talked about with staff creating that sidewalk as a multi-use path, I think was the vocabulary. And the decision was simply no. So that was something, I don't know, we can't widen it, maybe
It's a staff position, not your position.
Correct. Widen it if we want. But looking at it from the overhead, there's not enough room to widen it to what you want, which is a sidewalk and a bike lane. You're gonna widen it a couple of feet, we might be able to squeeze another foot of concrete on there, maybe. I mean, I'm not even positive, that lantern, you can adjust
There's
that.
also, if you look on Street View, the utility poles mentioned, their guide wires actually go across the sidewalk.
Oh, yeah.
So you have the telephone poles, the guide wires, and the sidewalk in the middle. So there's really no room. If you widen it, you're gonna clip yourself on the guide wire.
We shoehorned the thing in 15 years ago, but we met all the requirements, and who perceived that we would have county instruction on bike lanes at the time? So it does seem a little bit awkward that, and I own 3 very expensive bikes, don't get me wrong, I'm a biker. I'd love to bike the 11.8 miles to work. That'd be kind of cool. And I'd love to see it develop all that way, all the way out to New Kent, which is where I live. But to force this issue on that little parcel doesn't seem realistic, and I can guarantee you it is cost prohibitive. I will not be able to expand if I've got to put $1 million into VDOT and utilities and Cox and everybody else and literally move Richmond Road.
So is that responsive, Mr. O'Connor, to your?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I drive it all the time. I know the elevation change. I didn't
Right.
realize there was a BMP on the back
That's the other side of it.
so-
Yeah, it was carefully designed to work. It just, we didn't anticipate a bike lane. Who would have?
So, in per our discussion here, so again, realistically, we've got a residence next door, right? In what timeline or what could possibly happen where they're gonna, I mean, what point would the bike lane come to their house? It wouldn't, right? I mean, I can't imagine, unless that property somehow changes hands and it's no longer a residence. I mean, again, they're not gonna ever pay for that. So I don't know, it's pretty tricky. I mean, this isn't an easy, clear-cut situation by any means. So, no.
Part of my dilemma is I'm very supportive of this application. I am very supportive of a local business expanding, and I mean, you can go through all of that, but, and to the comment about, well, it's just this one parcel of land, here's the dilemma that I have to weigh, is it's not just that one piece of property, it's any subsequent property along that whole area. Could say, well, the utility work is cost prohibitive, and so we're not going to put a bike lane in either. And so then, on the one hand, you have a regional bikeways plan that shows this area being used, but it's also impacting the ability of a local business to bring forward a worthwhile expansion. So it's a very difficult dilemma to deal with.
I mean, in my opinion, in this situation, it's a very faulty plan. So there are huge problems with this. And I mean, and again, back to homeowners, like, nobody's gonna have the money to do something like this. It's insane.
Not unless VDOT
Yeah.
did a project on Richmond Road that involved doing some widening or doing
Right.
some lane changes and then putting a bike path in as part of that project.
Right, it's like the Pocahontas Trail study that we've been doing. Yeah, there's a situation where I could see it happening, but it's not gonna be coming piecemeal in these one-off situations. It's
Yeah.
just, it's ridiculous.
Are we being asked to overturn the whole bikeway method?
No,
Well,
but hey,
well,
maybe we should look
I
into that.
Actually, I think in a way we are, aren't we?
I think that if this didn't come up with Norge Dentistry, it would come up, it will come up eventually. So it definitely has to be looked at because it's problematic and,
You know, I mean, it's problematic through the whole Lightfoot to Toano corridor, you know, especially from Lightfoot to Miss Bagwell's property, because everything is is curb and gutter all the way to that point. So, you know, to expect future development to the east back towards Lightfoot to, you know, I mean, I think that's the decision we're impacting, is not just this parcel, but, you know, is it a reasonable expectation of development through there? So, you know, and I, as a part of that plan when it was last approved, and understand what the intent and the purpose is, but, you know, also, we didn't have the state law at the time that said move over and give bikers 3 feet, you know, so, you know, so, I mean, the laws have changed to accommodate bike traffic as well, so, I'm not sure what the right answer is.
And one last thing I wanted to add too is, like, from a cost standpoint, the cost comes down exponentially if it's a large segment is done at once. If you're just like slowly doing one lot at a time, you know, and I don't know, it seems like more something that needs to be publicly funded if we're going to go through this area.
I just follow up on 2 minor items. Number one, does the regional bikeways plan have an estimated build-out date, if you will, as to when everything is going to be in place? So that's an open-ended project. And as we're talking, I'm reminded the CIP stormwater project that's going on in Toano has been designed, and as part of a traffic calming feature, the vehicle lanes have been reduced to 11 feet, and it's 3 lanes, and they're taking the reduced footage and putting those into bike lanes. And so, you know, there you have it, and maybe that's the answer, that you're not necessarily throwing the regional bikeways plan out the window, but you're recognizing the fact that unless public entities get involved and do something creative like that, it's not a reasonable expectation to ask individual property owners to move utility lines and deal with some of the constraints that are evident on this property and many others as well. So that's sort of where I think I'm starting to move, is to say there's no defined completion date for a regional bikeways plan. It can still stay as a piece on it, but maybe that piece doesn't get accomplished until there's a major road resurfacing project or something like that that would allow smaller vehicle lanes to accommodate bicycle lanes.
It's bothered me over the last year as we've looked at projects on Route 60 and all the way up. And it's bothered me from the point of view that when you look at the comp plan and you look at the specific corridor studies for 60, and they vary because there is one for an architectural one for Norge, as well as there is one for Tohana, is that what they don't take into consideration is whether it's reasonable to say you're going to have a 50-foot setback. And unless you do a complete rehab of an industrial area, you're never going to get that large area. And the same thing happens with the bicycle piece. So we force this guy to do this, but it's a bike to nowhere, on either side of the bike. So I think, you know, there needs to be probably a little bit more thought about what you want Norge to look like, so that when you do run into an opportunity like we did within Tohana, is that you can start to make some accommodations, even with the utilities piece on that. But maybe we need to look at those corridor pieces for those specific communities to try to preserve that look by really taking a more realistic way of how that impacts the existing piece of land that's in there for it. I'm struggling with the same thing. I mean, in terms of, financially, the investment that's made here, and then saying to a small business guy, I'm sorry, we're going to make you do the same thing that we're going to do for Croker. Okay.
One other issue. I plan to vote for this without the condition as it goes now, but I'd like to make a point that I've made on several other Norge developments. The traffic impact statement said there's 488 additional traffic count as a result of this expansion. And the staff memo noted that the 2035 volume projected for Richmond Road from Croker Road to Norge Elementary was 39,000 daily trips, and the level of service will remain A to C, which is true enough. That same study noted that the 2007 traffic was about 22,000. So it's almost doubled in those 28, well, looking out to 2035 will almost double from 2007. The Croker Road to Norge Elementary School section of the traffic study, forecast volumes indicate improvements needed and capital watch. And then from the Norge Elementary School to Centerville, they recommend congestion management improvement. This was done, as I pointed out before, without knowing of several other major developments that have since come on. So the 39,000 traffic count is likely to be considerably more. In fact, I doubt that the people who did that traffic study envisioned these 488 trips. They certainly didn't consider the switch of a lot of economic opportunities land in Upper York County to residential, which will feed into Richmond Road. And the comprehensive plan points out that there's no room to expand Richmond Road, as we've just been talking about right here. There's no room. It is fully developed on both sides, all the way from Norge, or from Croker Road, all the way into Richmond, so that if traffic situation fails, there's no way to fix it. I'm going to vote for this anyway, but I'm going to make this speech every time we have another development on Richmond Road. I don't know what the answer is. I know what the answer should have been 30 years ago. I don't know what it is now. But if this continues, we are going to have a real mess on our hands. Economic mess, quality of life mess. There are 22 traffic lights from Croker Road to Monticello Avenue on Richmond Road right now. It's supposed to be a community character corridor. It's nuts. So anyway.
Jack, I think the 488 was the number, like include, not new trips, like that includes the, already, that's the total.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
I misread that then.
I don't think it was an increase of, yeah. Is that right? Or did I just make that up? I got that. But yeah, good points.
Other comments? Close the public hearing. Discussion by commissioners beyond what has already been discussed. Have a motion, please?
I'll make a motion to approve the SUP and exclude condition number 6.
Question on the motion.
Is it a recommendation to the Board of Supervisors that they exclude 6?
Correct.
Okay.
What would you please call the roll?
Ms. Dowdy?
Aye.
Mr. Polster?
Aye.
Mr. Schmidt?
Aye.
Mr. O'Connor?
Aye.
Mr. Krupp?
Aye.
And Mr. Haldeman?
Aye.
Thank you. Motion carries.
Moving on to public hearing number 2, Ordinance -19-0001, zoning ordinance amendment, section 24-16, proffer of conditions. Mr. Holt.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission. Back on September 13th in 2016, the Board of Supervisors adopted case number ZO-0008-2016, which amended the zoning ordinance to state that the county would no longer accept proffers for applications for any portion of a rezoning application that included a residential component. This, at the time, was in reaction to Senate Bill 549, which was passed and approved during the 2016 General Assembly session. On March 5th of this year, the General Assembly changed the Code of Virginia, and those updates and amendments were approved by the governor and enacted. Upon review, the adopted changes in state code appear to address many of the concerns that were stated by the board when it adopted that 2016 ordinance amendment. Accordingly, on April 9th of this year, the Board of Supervisors adopted an initiating resolution directing staff to more thoroughly consider the effects of the changes in the state code and recommend any warranted changes to the James City County Code Section 2416 to accept proffers associated with new residential rezonings. The proposed amendment that's included in your agenda packets tonight reverses that code amendment that was passed by the Board of Supervisors in 2016 and would allow the county to start accepting proffers again with residential rezonings. As included in subsequent email discussions with you all, that doesn't mean everything just sort of automatically goes back to the way it was. We wish that was that easy, but we're going to have some additional work to do with some of the board-adopted policies that are going to need specific amendments, and we've got some discussions hopefully planned with the Planning Commission and board at your joint work session in July. However, for the code amendment, which is a pretty straightforward piece that's in your agenda packets tonight, that amendment was considered by the Policy Committee at its May 9th meeting, and as Mr. Croft mentioned earlier, Policy Committee recommended approval of the item by a vote of 3-0. Staff recommends approval as well, and be happy to answer any questions. Mr. Halavin is here as well.
Questions?
I just think it's funny, we all had an inkling this would be coming back around, you know.
No questions? I won't ask for disclosures. Open the public hearing. Applicant presentation, no. Commissioners, questions of the applicant?
I don't have any
No
speakers.
speaker cards,
Yeah,
no speakers.
correct. You would want to close the public hearing, though.
Discussion by commissioners. Have another speaker. Warning. I'm very much opposed to amending county code to permit proffers at this time, and I have 3 reasons for that position. Number one, as our county attorney stated, the state legislature's recent amendment to state code addresses, quote, many of the concerns, close quote, that led to the Board of Supervisors to stop accepting proffers. Many of them, perhaps, but not all. Senate Bill 549 passed in 2016 to amend Chapter 15.2-2303.4 of Virginia Code relating to conditional zoning was a bipartisan assault on the people of Virginia, passed by a Republican legislature and signed by a Democratic governor. This bill, one of several related bills limiting localities' statutory authority, enacted over the past 18 years under the Dillon Rule, threatened Virginians with untold risk and expense. The James City County Board of Supervisors and other boards and councils around the Commonwealth acted promptly and wisely to neutralize its effects by passing an ordinance refusing to accept proffers on residential development. This was not an ideal solution, but it was the only one that could protect the citizenry. Whatever reasons elected representatives passed this legislation, it has not benefited anybody in the residential development process, and it should be repealed in its entirety. The bill's ambiguity creates substantial legal risk and associated expense for county residents and represents undue meddling by the legislature in affairs more properly handled by developers, landowners, localities, and the courts. The county attorney, again, in his memo of June 2016, correctly listed 9 objections to the original legislation as the basis for recommending that the county no longer accept residential proffers. Several of those objections remain unaddressed. The first one, the limits imposed by the legislation greatly reduce the ability of developers to offer, quote, outside the box, quote, proffers not accompanied by extensive data. That is still the case. According to the General Assembly's own legislative policy, quote, more flexible and adaptive zoning methods are needed to permit differing land uses and at the same time to recognize effects of change, close quote. But this legislation, even after the amendment, reduces flexibility. Number 2, all proffers dealing with on-site issues are deemed unreasonable unless they address an impact that is, quote, specifically attributable, close quote, to a proposed new residential development. The county attorney noted the ambiguity of that term in 2016, and it is no clearer now. We have no definition of specifically attributable. Item 3, under Section C of the code, notwithstanding any other provision, this gets a little tedious, I'm sorry, but notwithstanding any other provision of law, general or specific, as used in this chapter, a proffer or condition amendment, whether on-site or off-site, offering voluntarily pursuant to a number of codes, shall be deemed unreasonable unless, number 1, if an off-site proffer, it addresses an impact to an off-site public facilities such that the new residential development or new residential use creates a need or an identified portion of a need for one or more public facility improvements in excess of existing public facility capacity at the time of the rezoning or proffer condition amendment. This condition is unchanged in the amendment, and it leaves no room for considering cumulative impact. The Hanover County Board of Supervisors, writing in 2016 to ask Governor McAuliffe to veto this bill, said it well, and I quote, "This bill appears to mean that all of the existing capacity in facilities such as roads must be exhausted before developers can proffer to contribute a pro rata share of the cost of capacity improvements that will be needed as new developments are constructed," close quote. And number 2, under that same section, each new residential development or new residential use applied for receives a direct and material benefit from a proffer made with respect to any such public facility improvements. A definition of direct and material is still missing and leaves open a great deal of risk. Next item, Section D2. Failure to submit proffers as set forth in Subdivision 1 shall not be a basis for the denial of any rezoning or proffer condition amendment application. Does that mean if no proffers are volunteered and the application is deemed by the local governing body to be detrimental without proffers, the lack of those proffers cannot be used as a reason for denial? Under Section E2, quote, "The court shall presume, absent clear and convincing evidence to the contrary, that such refusal or failure was the controlling basis for the denial," close quote. So, the locality is guilty unless proven innocent? Should the legislative branch tell the courts how they must rule in a case? Under Section E3, quote, "If any successful action brought pursuant to this section contesting an action of a local government body in violation of this section, the applicant may be entitled to an award of reasonable attorney fees and costs," close quote. Why isn't this symmetric? Why shouldn't the litigation expense be borne by each side? Or if imposed in its entirety on the losing side, why not on whichever side lost? This is unfair on its face, and the asymmetric risk will encourage frivolous lawsuits. Finally, and purely philosophically, why can't two competent legal principals negotiate a mutually beneficial rezoning application without the heavy hand of Richmond interfering? If development of a parcel will impact county residents, why shouldn't only both parties, the developer and the county, discuss the terms of the rezoning and what can be done to mitigate those impacts without a battery of lawyers? That was just my first objection. My second objection is a conviction that the county's original proffer policy did not come close to mitigating the many harmful effects of unrestrained sprawl development. We've seen an example of that today. County residents, not the developers, must pay to build new schools to accommodate enrollment growth. There is no reserve from cash proffered on earlier developments that brought about this enrollment increase. The county appropriates millions each year to mitigate damage from stormwater and expand sewers, but without reserves from proffers from the development that necessitated these costs. I think Senate Bill 549, as cynical as it was a godsend. It gives county leaders time to rethink the links between their development decisions and their long-term impacts on county taxpayers, which brings me to my third reason for my opposition to this. County government has begun another revision to its comprehensive plan, which will address a wide range of housing and land use issues, together with their derivatives, education, environment, transportation, community character, and public facilities. It recently received an extensive report from the Workforce Housing Task Force, which, together with the Housing Condition Study of 2016, contains voluminous data and many recommendations addressing housing needs of low-paid county workers. The comp plan update will include a survey of county residents, defining the definition and the direction in which they want to go. Revisions to the comp plan, housing and proffer policies, and the consideration of housing recommendations must not be implemented piecemeal, but as part of a coherent, integrated approach to residential housing in James City County. There is nothing to lose and everything to gain by waiting, so that when we do adopt a proffer policy, we do it right. Thank you. You've been very patient. Any other discussion by commissioners? Can I please have, excuse me.
I wanted to echo some of the points that you brought up that I also sent into my email. And it's the definition of what is reasonable and appropriate and the guidelines under which we and the Board of Supervisors would make that determination, especially when what is offered in writing is deemed to be reasonable by definition underneath this code. And so I'm not comfortable with how we could even be able to say it wasn't reasonable. And one of the things that we currently have to be able to do that is the financial impact analysis piece that at least would give you some inkling of how you would define what was reasonable in terms of impact of schools, other types of things of that nature, of which, as I look at what is being asked to do underneath this ordinance, that clearly to me would have to be redone in a way that you could then fall back and say it's not reasonable because it doesn't do this, this, and this for it. The second thing that bothers me about this reasonable and appropriate piece in terms of the way we do CIP is it's a 5-year horizon. That's it. And the impacts that we're talking about in a cumulative way, and even the impact on any one of those specific things, far exceed that 5-year horizon. And so one of the other things that I liked about what we were going to do within the strategic plan, and specifically 4 of the operational initiatives, of which 3 of those are being done within the comp plan underneath the contract for that. The cumulative impact, the financial impact analysis, and then outside of his plan is the 10-year both school and county CIP long-range plan, so that at some point in the next 2 years, we will have a way to say, here are the CIP requirements for capital investment over a 10-year period. And so that when somebody comes in and offers us a proffer, you have a benchmark that is an updated cumulative impact analysis, which it needs to be updated from when it was done by Mr. McDonald. We would have a CIP program that would be able to specifically forecast what the requirements are for the county. And within what the comp plan will be able to do is also a cumulative impact analysis, which is the point that you were trying to make when you start adding all of these things up, so that you would at least have a way to place into your comp plan with the analytics to be able to say what's reasonable for the growth of the county. And without those sort of metrics to be able to look at, I don't know how any of us, if we got something in front of us, would be able to say it's unreasonable. How would you define that? And that's probably the biggest thing that bothers me. Now, in the replies that came back from the staff, there's clearly a bunch of work that needs to be done. And it's not like that the county isn't moving in that direction already, investing money to be able to get these sorts of metrics in there. And so I'm kind of with Jack. What's the rush? What do we gain by not having those sort of things until we get that thing sorted out? I mean, the other factor in this thing is growth inside and outside of the PSA, which is also part of what we're going to be talking about in this 2-year count. So there's at least 4 of those operational initiatives out of the strategic plan that I think are going to be able to provide the Board of Supervisors and ourselves the sort of metrics to be able to determine whether or not something's reasonable and appropriate. And there's still a lot of more policy pieces that need to be done on that. So I agree with you in your assessment, and I plan to vote negative against this.
You know, one of the questions, well, I have a couple questions, and I'm going to ask Mr. Halavin at the end for an opinion on something. But I'm looking at certainly the whole idea of far-ranging metrics, as Mr. Polster mentioned, is something that we need to have in this county. And I think, you know, taking the broader view and identifying the priorities and so on and so forth is very important. But those initiatives, I think, could work in tandem to a proffer. And what I'm getting at is we have seen, well, first of all, we know that most development has adverse impacts of some sort, whether it be on traffic, whether it be on schools, whether it be fiscally or what have you. And so when the state legislature passed the law prohibiting residential proffers, what happened? We had applicants coming up with more creative solutions, which were really proffers anyway, easements, okay? And you saw that with the Oakland Point project. And so it's a way to get around the issue of proffers and say, all right, here's how we're going to mitigate our adverse impacts, and we're going to ask the county to sign off on this easement. And to me, the easement that has been used on a couple projects that have come forward so far is more cumbersome and not as clean to me as a proffer. And so I look at this strike through on the proposed ordinance to allow proffers as something that is cleaner and more effective than coming up with easements or other workarounds. Now, the question that I wanted to ask Mr. Halavin is, you know, listening to a lot of the concerns about the legal risk that the county would have with proffers, looking at ambiguity in the terms as to what's considered reasonable or unreasonable and so on and so forth. Could you weigh in from a legal standpoint? Are we at risk reintroducing proffers at this point in the game, or what are your thoughts, Max?
So the 2019 legislation, most of the changes with exception to the subsection D ones that Mr. Polster had mentioned about the reasonable proffers being allowed outside of that specifically attributable system, were to how the right of action is actually created under that new system. So in order for someone to bring a claim for an unreasonable proffer, they now have to object to that proffer in writing before the Board of Supervisors considers that legislative application. So the risk is reduced in this new framework. It's not gone, but it allows the board to sort of understand and feel out sort of the negotiation between staff, which is now explicitly allowed, and an applicant in crafting proffers, and understand the risks going forward when they're actually considering that application. So from a practical standpoint, there are fewer legal risks with the 2019 legislation than there were with the 2016 legislation.
Are there more risks with the 2019 legislation than there were before the 2016 legislation?
Yes.
Well, I very much agree with Mr. Kropp. I was not a fan of the easement And I think that if we don't accept proffers, then we will continue to see easements as a tool. And for me, the issue that raises is the enforcement opportunities that Mr. Holt has that come along with proffers don't exist with the easement. The easement enforcement goes to the county attorney's office and I'm assuming direction by the Board of Supervisors to go out and enforce the easement, whereas Mr. Holt has the ability as the planning director, if somebody doesn't comply with the proffer, to stop it at the site plan review. Paul, if I'm misspeaking, correct me, but he has different tools in his tool belt through the proffer process than, Paul doesn't get anything in the role through the easements. So as far as an application and a project moving forward. So, I recognize I'm in the minority because I never agreed with the county's position on not accepting proffers, period. I also understand that that's not my role, but I think that we should accept proffers, just for the simple fact that, so many of the applications, I'll keep going back to the housing opportunity policy. All the applications that we reviewed without proffers still incorporated the housing opportunity policy in some form or fashion as part of the discussion, but we couldn't tie a proffer to it. I recognize I'm a minority opinion, but I think proffers are a property right of a landowner, and by not accepting proffers, we're taking a right away from somebody to develop their proffer and mitigate the development. So, I intend to support it as it's put, because understanding that there's still additional work to do.
As do I, and if I could just ask one further clarifying question. Is it an oversimplification to say that with proffers, there are surety bonds that are tied to performance milestones? In other words, the developer has money in the game that if they don't comply with these proffers, or if something isn't being met, they can lose that money. Whereas the easement, did the easement not have any surety bonds attached to it? And so non-performance was strictly to be fought out in the courts, if you will, as opposed to saying, wait a minute, you have $100,000 here and you haven't installed this signal. Is that an oversimplification, or is that correct?
It might be a slight oversimplification. The proffers address timing of a lot of improvements, but during the site plan review and public improvement and land disturbing, that's when the county usually obtains the sureties for those improvements, and that system still exists.
Okay.
Without the proffer. So there could have been additional improvements, and the applicant would volunteer, I'll also put up surety before I get a CO in order that you guys are guaranteed to get that improvement. But for the actual site plan improvements, the county still has a surety for that.
Okay, thanks.
Within Chapter
I've got a
24.
follow-on question on the easement piece. In the case of the Oakland Point, is the easements that were granted there, were they to be delivered by before they could occupy the facility? Did they have to have those completed before then?
The easements?
Right.
The easements were signed prior to the board's action on that case. So they had offered to give away that land right prior to the board's consideration of the legislative action. So the easement itself was signed. A lot of the conditions of the easement were tied to, I believe, certificate of occupancy and land disturbing.
It just sort of depends on, at that point, what the item within the easement was.
So to come back to the question that was being asked of you by Tim, is you still have a lot of those tools, whether it's an easement or a proffer. I didn't hear your answer to his question.
Let me try to restate Mr. Halavan's response. It depends on whether or not the surety requirements for a public improvement required by the ordinances is triggered by the existing tools that are in the zoning ordinance or not. So it sort of depends.
Right.
My example for Oakland Point was, and I'm not trying to disparage anybody, but, you know, if they elected to sell that project at some point and somebody decided that it wasn't going to be a tax credit project and we lost the ability to have affordable apartments there, you know, the recourse is not through the zoning administrator and the planning division. The recourse then goes through the county attorney's office and the courts.
I'm sorry, I didn't want to get in there, but if I asked that question when we went through that, and the adjudication of the tax piece goes to the Virginia State Housing, who gave you the loan, which is tied to a federal thing and not to his easement.
Right. I think what Mr. O'Connor was saying is if, or let's say the applicant for that project, you know, said I'm going to do a LIHTC housing, and then came in with a site plan that wasn't, or came with a site plan and then it turned out they were renting for market rates and not abiding by their LIHTC, and were just foregoing the tax credits. Previously, if that was a proffered condition, the zoning administrator could enforce, and if it was an easement, our office would go in for an injunction rather than going through the zoning administrator.
Right, but in this particular case, that wasn't an easement issue.
Right.
So I was using an example. Use the fact that if they wanted to use hardy plank siding and decided to put vinyl siding in it, the enforcement piece doesn't fall to Mr. Holt, it falls to Mr. Halavin.
But in that particular case for Oakland Point, they took a density increase to that and were awarded, and that is part of the occupancy thing that they adhere to it, because they get the density increase.
I guess the point is that with proffers, you're able to enforce violations, whatever the actual scenario is, through the administrative process, whereas with the easement situation, violations typically had to go through the legal process.
Right. I think to Mr. Polster's point, in the R5 district, you can obtain a bonus density for committing to certain things. And a lot of times people would commit to those via proffer. They happen to commit to those things for the bonus density via the easement document. So there would still be a collaboration with zoning in the R5, because we would say you're not meeting your bonus density requirements,
Exactly.
which is a little bit, it's a little bit different in the R5 context.
Okay. And I don't, I think I understand your point about easements versus proffers, but I think to take one instance of that easement case, which is all we have, and then apply it across the board, I think is kind of unfair. And if this thing works out over the next 10 years or 2 years, as we start to get through what the details are, of which the housing opportunity policy was exactly one of the questions I asked. Are we going to be able to do this, yes or no? Well, the answer is we still have to go back through the process of defining that, of which the Housing Task Force is responsible. So some of these things that we're talking about that we had in proffers are some of the things that the legal folks over the last 3 or 4 years have found out workarounds, because there were things that we were doing already in the zoning piece. So I'm not ruling out the fact that some of those things that still are open can't be settled in the next 2 years with or without the proffers. And the housing opportunity policy is a perfect case in mind.
I just personally feel that proffers are a tool to allow us, meaning Planning Commission and ultimately the Board of Supervisors, to consider an individual case on its individual merits. And by creating, you know, more, I just feel like we have taken that tool away from landowners and developers, and we are looking for ways to create workarounds on a case-by-case basis when, you know, I think we do pretty well when we have the opportunity to meet with an applicant and talk about the things that are concerns and talk about the things where we gain some improvements. And I think we have done that successfully, especially in a lot of the commercial pieces. But, you know, we're gonna see it more and more as infill development comes along. You know, does it make sense that every piece that we would typically see proffered, you know, just that it goes away? So it doesn't give us that, to me, it doesn't give the county that flexibility to consider a case on the individual merits, which is mainly driven by, you know, what the topography of the land is and how much of it is developable. So.
Further comment? Please have a motion.
I'll make a motion that we disapprove zoning ordinance amendment ordinance 19-0001, zoning ordinance amendment to section 2416, proffer of conditions.
So let me restate that. So we sometimes, a little bit confusing sometimes when there's a motion to not approve. So if you vote aye to the motion, it would be to support the motion to not approve the amendment.
Roll, please call the roll.
Ms. Dowdy?
No?
Mr. Polster?
Aye.
Mr. Schmidt?
No.
Mr. O'Connor?
No.
Crop?
No.
And Mr. Haldeman?
Aye.
That motion did not.
So can I
think
motion to approve?
By Robert's
Yes.
rules, yes, there can be another motion.
I'd like to motion approval of ordinance -19-0001, zoning ordinance amendment, section 2416, proffer of conditions.
Dowdy?
Aye?
Mr. Polster?
No.
Mr. Schmidt?
Aye.
Mr. O'Connor?
Aye.
Mr. Crop?
Aye.
And Mr. Haldeman?
No.
Thank you, motion carried.
Public hearing number 3, ordinance 19-0002, zoning ordinance amendment, section 24-211, temporary offices. Mr. Holt.
Thank you very much. For something a little bit lighter. In 2018, the Development Review Committee and Planning Commission considered an applicant's request to waive the requirements of the zoning ordinance that were found in section 24-200, which is public utilities, as it applied to a temporary office. At a subsequent meeting of the Policy Committee, a committee member asked staff for a potential amendment to the ordinance to make future requests easier for applicants. Per that request, a proposed ordinance amendment is included in your agenda packets. At its May 9th meeting, the Policy Committee recommended approval of this item by a vote of 3-0. I'd be happy.
Questions of Mr. Holt? Closures, I'm sure. Open the public hearing. No speaker cards. Any questions? Close the public hearing. Discussion. Seeing none, may I please have a motion?
Chair, I motion to approve ORD-19-0002, zoning ordinance amendment, section 24-211, temporary offices.
And for clarification, I'm sorry, it should be section 111.
Oh, 111, okay. Yep.
Okay. Mr. Holt, please call the roll.
Ms. Dowdy?
Aye?
Mr. Polster?
Aye.
Mr. Schmidt?
Aye.
Mr. O'Connor?
Aye.
Mr. Crop?
Aye.
And Mr. Haldeman?
Aye.
Thank you, motion carries.
Public hearing number 4, ordinance 18-0013, zoning ordinance amendments regarding master plan consistency determination. Mr. Holt, you're earning your keep today.
Not the cause. Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, again, good evening. Currently, section 24-23, the zoning ordinance states that all final development plans may be approved by staff after approval of a master plan by the Board of Supervisors. All final development plans shall be consistent with the master plan, but may deviate from the master plan if the Director of Planning concludes that one of several criteria that are outlined in the ordinance are met. Generally around whether or not the plan significantly differs from the master plan that was approved by the Board of Supervisors. In the event the Director of Planning determines that the proposed change would deviate from the approved master plan, the applicant could appeal that decision to the Development Review Committee. At its May 22nd, 2018 work session, the Board of Supervisors asked the Commission to consider limiting the number of residential dwelling units that could be transferred via a master plan consistency determination that's made under Section 24-23 of the zoning ordinance. The Policy Committee discussed this code section at length and possible revisions at several of their meetings in 2018. At the request of the Policy Committee, the Board of Supervisors provided input into this matter at its November 27th, 2018 work session. The Policy Committee discussed this item further again in 2018 and several more times at meetings so far here in 2019. At its April 11th, 2019 meeting, the Policy Committee found that the ordinance amendment that's included in your agenda packets reflected the Board's requested amendments and voted to forward this item to the Planning Commission by a vote of 3-0. Questions?
Questions? Open the public hearing.
I'm sure we will after the public hearing, so.
Public hearing. No speaker cards. Close the public hearing. Discussion by commissioners. Seeing none, may I please have a motion?
I had a question,
Beg your pardon.
if I could. I sent Mr. Halavin a note just before. In the state code, section 15.2-2307 talks about vested rights. And it talks about, for purposes of this section, without limitation, the following are deemed to be significant affirmative governmental acts allowing development of a specific project. 1, the governing body has accepted proffers or proffered conditions which specify use related to a zoning amendment. The governing body has approved an application for rezoning for a specific use or density. Governing body or Board of Zoning Appeals has granted a special exception. Board of Zoning Appeals has approved a variance, and then there are 3 or 4 other items. So I asked Mr. Halavin to help me understand how this dovetails into that portion of the state code. So if I'm a developer and I have an approved density with a master plan, how it gets affected through a land, through changing densities in land base.
So if you're requesting, specifically with how the language is now compared to the amendment, or how sort of vested rights work in the context of a master plan amendment?
So how vested rights work in the context of having to come back through the legislative process to move density between land base. So meaning if I'm a developer or a landowner and I'm approved for, just for argument's sake, 2,000 units, and because the economy's changed, the market has changed, building processes have changed. I thought I was going to build out in 3 years, and it's 20 years later. So I want to then increase density in a land bay. Why do I have to come back through the legislative process versus I have an approval to go build up to 2,000 units?
Right. Okay, so from a 20,000 foot level, vested rights protect an approved development or something that's received that significant government act from subsequent changes to the zoning ordinance. So it's to protect if you increase the setbacks, or generally increase the setbacks, reduce the density, sort of those ordinance changes. The master plan that's approved as part of a rezoning application is a significant governmental act, and it does vest the developer's rights in that master plan itself. If they're bringing an amendment to that master plan, they don't have a right to amend the master plan except as allowed by the locality, which would be the subsection of our 24-23. So it doesn't implicate a vested right to ask for a change in what was previously approved, is the short answer.
I think maybe you had mentioned, please correct me if I'm wrong, before, that by definition now, this would say that change would mean that it's a significantly different plan, and therefore that amendment shouldn't be just assumed.
So in our existing 24-23, there is a process adopted by ordinance that allows a master plan amendment, which is sort of how business has gone on to date. So the county has chosen to give the planning director authority to allow certain changes on development plans. And this amendment would essentially say certain of those changes are too great and we don't want to allow those administratively. We want that to be processed through as a master plan amendment.
So prior, that was something that went to the DRC to determine consistency. So, I know that much of this is driven off the case that we had out at Stonehouse, where the developer wanted to change density. It went to the DRC and was ultimately determined to be consistent. Is that fair?
One of the things for the non-policy committee members, this was, there was a subtlety in the wording, and that is that this, the policy committee voted to move this forward to the full planning commission. The policy committee did not vote to approve the ordinance amendment. And one of the reasons, Mr. O'Connor was touching on, the way it's proposed right now, the DRC is an appeal authority for talking about whether there's a recreation or open space change, whether there's a significant traffic pattern change, whether there's a significant alteration of the character of the land uses. All of those are pretty substantial for a community, and the process is administrative. It goes to the planning director, who, if the planning director determines that it is a significant change, the developer can appeal it to the DRC. This proposed change, what this does is says, yes, the DRC can weigh in on any of those three items, but anything that has to do with dwelling unit types or dwelling unit locations doesn't have an administrative appeal. It has to go through the legislative process. And one of the things that I was concerned about was that if a developer has already gone through and for a parcel of land, no matter how many land bays there are, there's a build-out cap on the number of units, there's density specifications and so on and so forth. If they want to tweak that due to, as Mr. O'Connor said, market conditions, building techniques, what have you, is that reasonable to tell the developer, no, you're going to have to go back through the public hearing phase, back to the Planning Commission, back to the Board of Supervisors? There might be some significant financial impacts as far as outstanding building loans that, it can take, we know how long it could take to go through the legislative process, months and months. So the concern was that, at least my concern was that this change to the ordinance is an overreach of a process that had already gone through the legislative actions necessary, and is it reasonable for a developer not to be able to say, you know what, I want to move X number of units from this land bay to that land bay for the following reasons. And so that's where I personally had some misgivings about this proposed change to the ordinance. And I just wanted to frame a little bit of the background context.
Well said, I think.
Thank you.
Are you through? I'm sorry.
Yes, I am.
My only concern about this whole thing is the dwelling unit count, and not so much one land bay to the next. But I was reminded again in reading the material under residential plan community district R4, and it's only in here, it's not universal, but it says the purpose of the master plan and community impact statement is to set overall population and development ceiling for the planned community, to determine off-site impacts of the development, and to identify the general arrangement of internal land uses. The 2423, of course, lays out the community impact statement and all the things it applies to, archaeological, adequate public facilities, fiscal impact, environment, water and sewer, traffic. And so if that's all been determined as part of the original legislative process, it's been approved, those have all been taken into consideration. Now, later, for whatever number of reasons, the total building count changes significantly. I don't think asking a developer to go back through a legislative process is asking too much if there's a significant change in the unit.
Yeah, no, if it's a change in the unit count, then that would have to go through a master plan amendment.
Right, and that's,
But if you're taking, my point is, you know, as part of the development scheme, the county's provided with a as Mr. Hlavin talked about, a 20,000-foot level, saying, you know, here, you know, going back to the 2,000 cap piece, you know, it's 2,000 units, you know, we being the county make a decision based on this application on 2,000 units, and that's you know, what the impacts are on schools, fire, parks and rec, roads, you name it. And so the scheme of development has traditionally been in James City County that, you know, there is flexibility in that master plan because we're not doing, as we've talked about, you know, the developer's not doing soils and stormwater and all that engineering work in the front. And if he finds that there are places that can't be developed to a certain density, so he wants to move from this land bay to another land bay, but stays below the 2,000 cap, why do we care? You know, and, you know, going back to 2008 and the Business Climate Task Force, one of the things that we were asked to do and we have attempted to do through ordinance rewrites and through the various comp plans has been to make the system more predictable and the like. So I just feel as for a developer, we are creating that second bite at the apple to say, you know, and potentially force them to downsize their development. And I just think that if I'm a developer, whether I've gotten bank loans or investors, and, you know, I've been approved to go to 2,000 units, and we've made decisions subsequently on the impacts on other developments and comp plans, that developer should have the right to go to the 2,000 units, you know. And I guess for Mr. Holt, my question is, you know, if we have a developer that comes in and says, I want to reduce by 30%, are we making them go through the legislative process too, or do they just get to reduce by 30%? I think it goes both ways on that piece, so it's my 2 cents.
This case has bothered me from the very beginning that the DRC heard this. And it seems to me that we've been in search of a problem with a solution that says, let's do this. And I think when you all were investigating how many previous incidents that you had over some period of time. I don't think he came up with more than 2 to include this one, if I'm correct. And so, you know, we're going to go through a bureaucratic process to come up with a solution of something that doesn't occur. Now, the one thing that did bother me about this when it came to the DRC was that the developer, in good conscience, went to the homeowners association of 12 members and got their approval. Now, what was disturbing was the number of people from the community that didn't know this was going on that attended that meeting. And so the question became, what's the role of the homeowners association and that board they elected in terms of looking out for their interests, which is what they're supposed to do? Or is that for something for the government to get in the middle of something that they've already approved at? And so we're forcing them back to this issue of a bite of the second apple. Over what? What did they do wrong? Now, on the other hand, we still haven't seen it, but it's in process for the last 6 or 8 months. But the Stonehouse guys are coming in through a legislative process to change what their master plan is going to look like. And so what they essentially did was move density within the total number that they had into land base that they wanted to develop and then not give up. I mean, I think that's perfectly reasonable for them to be able to do within what we approved. So I'm just really puzzled. And of course, the fact that the policy committee, after going through this for how many months, sends this to us and says, we're not recommending this thing, we're just moving it along the process. I don't intend to support this.
Further comments?
No, just one. I agree with Mr. Polster that I think that, you know, the recourse for the homeowner or the homeowners association is separate, independent of governmental actions. So that's, I think that's the part that has really been hard for me to get my arms around on this.
Entertain a motion.
I'll make a motion not to approve Ordinance 18-0013, zoning ordinance amendment regarding master plan consistency determination.
I think it's better to, if we can frame it in the affirmative, so maybe a motion to recommend denial.
Okay, I'll make a recommendation of denial of Ordinance 18-0013, zoning ordinance amendment regarding master plan consistency determination.
Again, procedurally, just to clarify the motion, an aye vote would be in support of the motion, which would be to recommend denial of this to the board.
Call the roll, Mr. Holt.
Dowdy.
Aye.
Mr. Polster.
Aye.
Mr. Schmidt.
Aye.
Mr. O'Connor.
Aye.
Mr. Krupp.
Aye.
And Mr. Haldeman.
Aye.
Thank you. Motion carries.
Planning Commission considerations. Initiation of consideration of amendments to the zoning ordinance regarding inoperable motor vehicles and oversized commercial vehicles.
Me as well. Thank you very much. Taking the lion's share of these tonight, but it's okay.
Time and a half today.
Sorry you have to hear my voice one more time. Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, before you, for your consideration, is simply an initiating resolution. During the 2019 session of the General Assembly, again, amendments were made to the county charter. This charter amendment grants additional authority to James City County under Section 15.2-905 of the Code of Virginia to regulate the keeping of inoperable motor vehicles on residential, commercial, and agricultural zoned properties that are 2 acres in size or smaller. In addition, staff has received complaints regarding the parking and or keeping of oversized commercial type vehicles in residentially zoned areas. The situation is not adequately addressed by existing zoning ordinance text or regulations. It's recommended to direct staff to research neighboring localities and to recommend changes to address the parking and keeping of oversized commercial-type vehicles on residentially zoned areas. Staff recommends the Planning Commission adopt the attached resolution to initiate consideration of such amendments to the zoning ordinance and to refer this matter to the Policy Committee. And again, just in summary, this is a procedural step that is required by state code just to begin the discussion process and to get the Policy Committee started on this. This does not change any of the existing code, and this is not a public hearing item because we're not changing any of the code in the text. So again, this is just a procedural step to start the process, and is staff's recommendation.
Any discussion? Please have a motion.
Motion to adopt the initiating resolution to, regarding inoperable motor vehicles and oversized commercial vehicles.
All in favor?
Aye.
Need to
Or do you
take
need
a
to-
roll call
I
vote.
beg your
Yes, sir,
pardon?
since it's a resolution.
Sorry.
That's all right. Ms. Dowdy,
Aye.
Mr. Polster.
Aye.
Mr. Schmidt.
Aye.
Mr. O'Connor.
Aye.
Mr. Crop.
Aye.
And Mr. Haldeman.
Aye.
Thank you. Motion carries.
Planning Commission discussion, Board of Supervisor coverage next Tuesday, the 11th. Mr. O'Connor. Mr. Kropf reminds us that the Novus Agenda facility is now available to all commissioners regardless of which committee you happen to serve on. I don't have anything else.
Mr. Haldeman, I think we hopped planning director's report.
You did indeed. I'm sorry. No
Okay.
offense.
None taken. I didn't have anything additional to add tonight anyway, but
We were talking so much, we just assumed that the report was rolled in
got
there
it all
somewhere.
out. That's right. I got it all out of my system. I didn't have anything
Nothing at
additional.
all.
No,
I
sir.
apologize.
Can I ask Mr. Holt one quick question in reference to this oversized commercial vehicles? Is that, when we talk about residential zoning, does that include, is that just to the lots, or does that include the streets within a community that are controlled by VDOT?
That might be something I need to look at and get back in touch. Restrictions for whether or not you can parallel park out in the public right of way are different than the zoning ordinance reg. But as we move forward in this process, we'll try to find out a lot more detail for you on that.
That just seems to be the complaint that I get most often, is that, you know, we have communities where the streets are narrow and people are parking oversized vehicles, commercial vehicles, trailers on the public right-of-way, and, you know, there's little to do to enforce that other than.
Unless it's signed or there's some other provisions in the county code, again, at the end of the day, almost all of the streets in the county are public, and as such, there's generally no prohibition against parking a properly licensed vehicle in the public right-of-way. Move forward, we'll make sure to think through some of those distinctions and supplement that information for you.
Thanks.
I just, quick sort of question, in light of, I guess this might be for Mr. Lavin, but in light of the tragic events to our east in Virginia Beach this past week, if memory serves me correct, firearms are allowed in most of our county's public buildings except, of course, schools and the courthouse. Is that correct, that they are allowed in public meetings here, or is?
Yes, in general, that is
And
correct.
is that state code?
I believe it is state code. I'd have to double check on that, though.
Yeah, and the only reason why I bring that up is obviously there are occasions where our public hearings can get emotional, and I'd prefer firearms not be in our public hearings, but anyhow. That.
Further? Not before it starts raining again, may I please have a motion to adjourn?
Do we want to review the director's report?
I didn't have anything.
no,
Oh, you didn't have
additional.
any,
If you
okay.
had questions, I can certainly try to help, but I didn't have anything
No
additional.
questions?
Did you have some questions?
No.
No, okay. Motion to adjourn?
So move.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you.